before I said a single word about my research, some of you have already decided whether you trust me. Not consciously, you didn't sit down and think, right, let me assess this person's credibility. You just felt it, or didn't. In about the first 2 seconds of watching me walk in and sit down, your brain made a judgment about whether I seem warm, whether I seem engaged, whether I seem like someone worth listening to. That instinct you just had? That's my dissertation. My name is Ben Etchells Rimmer, and I spent the entirety of this project working out exactly how much posture matters before you even open your mouth. Specifically in counselling, where that first impression might be the difference between a client feeling safe and comfortable enough to talk or not talk at all. I want to start not with my research, but with a question. If you've trained as a counsellor, and most of you have, cast your mind back to the very beginning. Day one, probably. Someone stood at the front of that class and taught you how to sit. They probably taught you solar. S, sit squarely. O, open posture. L, lean forwards. E, eye contact. And R, relaxed. Egan introduced this in 1975, that's over 50 years ago, and it is still the default model taught in counselling training programs, coaching, nursing, healthcare communication, you name it. If someone has been trained to attend to a client non-verbally, there's a reasonable chance they've learned solar. And for a long time that was fine. It was clear, it was memorable, it gave trainees something to hold on to when everything else felt overwhelming. But here's the thing about solar. No one ever tested it. Not properly. There's no empirical evidence that sitting squarely makes a client feel heard. There's no study showing that leaning forward at a specific angle improves therapeutic outcomes. And that matters. When a model goes untested for 50 years, it doesn't just stay still, it solidifies. It gets embedded in training programs, passed down from supervisor to trainee, referenced in textbooks, cited in practice guidelines. The absence of evidence isn't treated as a gap, it's treated as the consensus. And the R is the most telling example of this. Relaxed, the final letter of solar, and the only one that was never operationalized. Nobody defined what relaxed actually looked like in a body. Nobody described what it meant for a counsellor to be relaxed in a way that a client could perceive. It was just assumed. An instruction without specification, which is exactly the gap this study set out to fill. It was designed as a practical heuristic, a memory aid, and it became gospel through repetition rather than evidence. And as the field has evolved, the cracks started to show. Solar tells you to sit squarely, but in some cultural contexts that reads as confrontational. It tells you to maintain eye contact, but for clients with trauma histories, sustained eye contact can feel threatening rather than warm. It was built for one kind of client, in one kind of room, in one cultural moment. A model called Surety came along, and in 2011, this tried to fix it. It was more relational, it was more culturally sensitive, and more focused on the qualities a counsellor is trying to embody rather than the exact position of their knees. A genuine improvement. But Surety has its own problem. It's so broad that it's almost impossible to test. Be supportive, tune into the client. These aren't behaviours, they're intentions, and you can't put intentions in a video clip and ask people to rate it. Which is where relaxed comes in. This study asked whether counsellors adopting a relaxed posture are perceived as more empathetic, understanding and comfortable to work with than those displaying non-relaxed postures. The relaxed model was developed as a structured but flexible alternative, something specific enough to test empirically but flexible enough to use in the real world without making you look like you're performing a checklist. R was for reflected posture, grounded, stable and open. E, eye contact maintained, but not a stare. L, leaning forwards, interest without intrusion. A, arms open, no barriers. X, xiphoid expression, which sounds terrifying. The xiphoid process is the bottom tip of your sternum. A xiphoid expression is that quality of being alert, sharp and engaged in your upper body, present without being rigid, attentive without being tense. E, extra movements minimized, fidgeting checked out. D, distractions ignored, the phone stays in the pocket. Each element was deliberately chosen to address something existing models missed. The xiphoid element draws on the polyvagal theory, the idea that we read stability in another person's body as a signal of safety before we process a single word they've said. The second E element addresses micro distractions that Solar and Shorty don't even mention. The whole model tries to integrate what contemporary counselling now understands about embodiment, trauma, and cultural nuance. That's the theory. The question was, does it actually work? So, the method. We made 24 short silent videos, 10 seconds each, a counsellor sitting across from a client. 12 different posture positions from the full relaxed posture down through each individual element being violated one at a time, all the way to a completely non-relaxed posture. Then we put those videos into our study on-site toolkit and asked 81 strangers to watch them and tell us whether the counsellor seemed empathetic, understanding, and like someone they'd feel comfortable talking to. That's it. That's a study. We made silent videos of someone sitting in a slightly different way. But that was precisely the point. By removing the sound, no voice, no words, no verbal content at all, we could isolate the posture as the only variable. Any difference in how participants rated the counsellor had to come from how they were sitting, nothing else. 81 participants were randomly assigned to either a male counsellor condition or a female counsellor condition. They all rated 12 posture clips. Lower scores meant a more favourable perception. And we ran repeated measure ANOVAs to see whether the posture condition significantly affected those ratings. For the male counsellor, the effect size was partial letter squared equal to 0.66. For the female counsellor, partial letter squared equals 0.65. In psychological research, anything above 0.14 is considered a large effect. We got 0.66. Posture wasn't just statistically significant, it accounted for nearly 2/3 of the variance in how that counsellor was perceived. The full relaxed posture consistently produced the most favourable ratings across both conditions. And every time an individual component was violated, arms closed, limb removed, eye contact absent, ratings dropped. Each element is contributing something real. And if you look at the individual components, a more interesting picture starts to emerge. The two violations that hit hardest, that dropped ratings most dramatically, were reflective posture and extra movements. Fidgeting, small distracting shifts, which makes sense when you think about what's happening neurologically. Before we've consciously registered anything about another person, our nervous system is already scanning them. Regulated or dysregulated? Are they safe or uncertain? A still, grounded body reads as calm. A fidgeting one introduces a low-level question. Is this person actually here? And that question colours everything that follows. Eye contact mattered too, particularly for the male counsellor. Take it away entirely and ratings drop quickly. In Western therapeutic contexts, looking at someone is the most basic signal that you're attending to them. Remove it and the whole impression unravels. The arms condition was more nuanced. Crossed arms produced worse ratings, but not by as much as you'd expect. One violation, when everything else is warm and open, gets noticed partially, but is forgiven. The overall impression carries some weight even when one element is off, which actually tells us something useful. The goal in training isn't perfection, it's coherence. There was also an unexpected pattern worth mentioning. For the male counsellor, the fully non-relaxed posture actually produced more favourable ratings than several of the individual component violations. Which seems counterintuitive until you think about it this way. A wholly non-therapeutic posture reads as socially familiar, but a single violation within an otherwise therapeutic stance creates a noticeable incongruence. The counsellor looks present and engaged in every other respect, which makes the one thing that's off more visible rather than less. It's the same reason a slightly off note is more noticeable in an otherwise really well-played piece of music. And one more finding worth flagging. The relaxed plus touch condition, where the model was adopted but the counsellor also touched the arm or hand of the client opposite them, produced less favourable ratings than the other relaxed variants, particularly for the male counsellor. But here's where it gets really interesting. As an exploratory analysis, I compared ratings for the male and female counsellor across each posture condition. For most conditions, there was no significant difference. When both counsellors adopted the full relaxed posture, their ratings were almost identical. But in the non-relaxed condition, the female counsellor in a non-relaxed posture was rated with a mean score of 4.09 out of 5. That is nearly at the ceiling of unfavourable ratings. One explanation is role congruity theory. The idea that women are implicitly expected to display warmth, attentiveness, and emotional availability, and that violating those expectations is judged more harshly than the same behaviour in a man. A disengaged male counsellor reads as distracted, but a disengaged female counsellor reads as a deep failure, a violation of what she's expected to be. And that's not a comfortable finding, but it's an important one. And it raises a question that none of the existing models have ever asked. Solar doesn't mention gender. Surety doesn't mention gender. No postural framework in counselling training currently acknowledges that the same body in the same posture may land completely differently depending on who it belongs to. If a female counsellor has a hard session, if she's tired, if she's just a bit less composed than normal, or she's distracted, the data says she'll be judged far more harshly than that for a male colleague in exactly the same state. That's not a personal failing. That's just how therapeutic presence gets perceived. And that's a problem. And if we're serious about training that works for everyone, it needs to be named out loud. What relaxed seems to offer is something like a protective floor. When both counsellors were fully relaxed, the gap closed, and that's not a small thing. That's actually one of the more compelling arguments in this whole study for why postural training matters, not just for the client, but for the counsellor. And it points to something that relaxed might offer that goes beyond just better posture. Because when both counsellors adopted the full relaxed posture, the gender gap disappeared. Ratings were statistically equivalent. Posture in those conditions appears to level the playing field. If non-verbal communication can act as a stabilising factor, promoting more consistent perceptions regardless of the counsellor's gender, then that's a genuinely significant argument for making a postural awareness a central part of training rather than an afterthought. There are limitations, and I want to be honest about them. 10-second silent clips are not a therapeutic session. The sample was predominantly female and relatively small. We're measuring perception, not an outcome. A counsellor can adopt a relaxed posture and still be a poor therapist, and equally vice versa. But what this study has suggested is that therapeutic presence doesn't begin when the counsellor speaks. It begins before all that. In the quality of the stillness, in the openness of the body, in what a client's nervous system registers before a single word has been exchanged. The relaxed model offers a practical, evidence-based framework for developing that presence, not as a performance, not as another checklist to tick off in training, but as a foundation for the kind of genuine attunement that effective counselling requires. What if postural awareness was a thread that ran through training rather than a one-off session? Something that trainees could come back to in supervision, in video review sessions, in personal development, asking not what did I say, but how was I sitting when I said it? There's a real opportunity here to bring posture into supervision more explicitly. When we review counsellor recordings, we're already watching for the things that matter. If posture accounts for 2/3 of how a counsellor is perceived, adding that lens doesn't change the process. It just makes it more complete. The relaxed model isn't the answer to all of that. It's a starting point, something specific enough to teach, flexible enough to adapt, and, for the first time, backed by evidence. When I sat down at the start of this recording without saying anything, some of you registered something. A sense of whether this was going to be worth your time. Apparently, how I was sitting had more to do with that than anything I've said since. Therapeutic presence doesn't begin when you speak. It begins the moment a client sees how you're sitting.